My mission is to help make our food system healthier, more sustainable and ethical. In a market where consumers are making more informed decisions about the food they buy, I believe that food businesses catering to these needs will be the most successful. I'm Michael Fox, CEO and co-founder of shiitake mushroom company Peppou Food. For years, I've been obsessed with our food system. Welcome to my podcast where I talk shiitake with successful chefs, food industry executives and entrepreneurs to learn about what's led to their success in the food industry. Welcome to the very first episode of my new podcast, Talking Shiitake. In this episode, I speak with George Peppou, co-founder of cell-cultured meat company VOW. George and I met back in 2019 when we were both figuring out our paths into the alternate protein space. George went with cell-cultured meat and I went with mushrooms. We each thought the other was crazy, but put small angel checks into each other's businesses just in case we were wrong and the other was right. So far, we're both happy with our decisions, but we'll see how this plays out. George has done an incredible job building VOW. They've progressed tremendously well. On the technical front, VOW is fully vertically integrated and their costs of production are coming down into the premium meat territory. And they've built the largest operating cell culture line for food production anywhere in the world by quite a margin. And they've achieved this having raised 1/10 the capital of other major cell-based meat companies. George has taken a very clever go-to-market approach. Rather than trying to leap straight to the mass market, VOW have launched their luxury Forge brand and quail parfait product into 3 high-end restaurants in Singapore, with more restaurants and cities launching later this year. Next stop will be the premium health niche targeting customers looking for meat products with very high protein, iron, and micronutrient density in a highly bioavailable, delicious format. It's a strategy taken straight from one of my favourite business books, Crossing the Chasm by Jeffrey A. Moore, which inspires us at Fable too. George and I talk about the potential challenges for the cell-cultured meat space, given strong consumer trends towards real food, and George provides some interesting analogies with the growth of the cereal category. Finally, George shares the story of their incredible PR win that he and his co-founder Tim Noakesmith drove with their Mammoth Meatball, which led to coverage in nearly every major global news outlet and appearances on Stephen Colbert, amongst many other TV and news shows. This was a very inspiring conversation and exactly why I wanted to start this podcast, so I can talk shiitake and share some of the incredible conversations I'm fortunate to have with inspiring people like George. I'm new to hosting a podcast and I'd love any feedback on what you liked, didn't like, or think I can improve. But with that, please meet George Peppou. George, we first met in 2019. We were both exploring, we both wanted to enter the sort of meat alternative space. We were talking through the different ways to go about doing that. You were sort of leaning more towards cell-based. I was leaning a little bit more towards mushroom-based. And yeah, we ended up going those 2 separate paths, but we debated, we traded notes. I learned a lot from the conversations with you and we've stayed in close contact since. But yeah, making that decision to go into cell-based and starting VOW 5 years later. How do you feel about that?
I definitely chose the harder technical option. There's no doubt about that. I think the surprise now with 5 years of, 5 years under our belt is the things which are hard are not what I expected to be hard. I remember I was rereading some of my old notes a few weeks ago, and the things which were in the media at that point and things which folks in the industry were talking about around cell line development and around media development and around supply chains and growth factors, those were not the really challenging parts. The really challenging parts have been around how do you take a process that works once and figure out how to make it work every single time? How do you figure out what is safe with a new ingredient with a totally unique risk profile? One of the big unexpected challenges is because cell culture is sterile when you harvest it, that creates a really unique and very unusual risk profile for microbiology. If there's nothing there, there's nothing to compete. And so understanding what that risk profile looked like and how we need to manage it was a really quite unique and fairly significant challenge. And so it has been a really hard technical road and there's been a lot of things we've had to solve, but the hard bits are not where I thought they would be. I do think my conviction in the technical choice has grown with time. I think 2019 was the height of the beyond impossible plant-based cycle. And I think both you and I spoke about it at the time, that direct replacement route where you're essentially trying to trick consumers wasn't a particularly compelling one. It didn't feel like that was how consumer behavior change was going to happen. And I think that has really played out. And then when it comes to the technology choice, cell culture, whilst being challenging and whilst having there's a lot of things we have to be really, really, really good at to bring a product to market at any kind of scale. The biochemical complexity of cell culture and the ability to have so much utility from a flavor, nutrition, functionality perspective in a single ingredient, that is looking more and more appealing, especially as we've seen how much pushback the conventional plant-based products have gotten by having so many ingredients and being so processed. And so cell culture being somewhat pure while also having that more complex, more animal-like biochemistry, that does feel like a better bet the further we get into this. And the technical hurdles, we've had a lot to jump through so far, and there's still many more to go. But generally, I feel very confident that the technology is working in the way that we need it to, and the physics are going to allow us to reach a scale and cost structure that we set out to.
Yeah, interesting. What specifically that sort of have single ingredient but complexity in the single ingredient? Can you go into a bit more what you mean by that?
By changing the nutrients in the media we're culturing those cells in, we can change the chemical makeup of the cells. And if we want to drive more fat production for a richer, fattier mouthfeel, we can do that by changing the media they're grown in. If we want to drive more phospholipid production, there's ways that we can change it so there's more smaller cells, etc. So you're able to sort of get a lot of different components, both macronutrient and micronutrient components, in a single ingredient on an ingredient list. When it comes to what is listed on the back of a pack or listed on a pack of the products we have in market, it's just cultured Japanese quail cells and anything else we choose to add. But the cells themselves are a single ingredient, regardless of how we've grown them to have a different macronutrient, flavor, or functional property for that particular product.
Gotcha. So it's not like you're genetically engineering the cells to go and do different things. You're adjusting the macro and micronutrient profile by the nutrient media that the cells are growing in. So yeah, quite a...
Exactly. And we don't use GM in the products that we have on market today. And that was a very deliberate choice. It's more similar to how animals are grown, where if you change the feed mix, or if you change the animal genetics, in our case, change to a different cell line, you change the composition of the meat and the quality of the meat that comes out the other side. So you can think of it more like a primary production system. Change the feed mix, change the meat.
On the technology side, just sticking to that for now, before we get into some of the consumer elements, what have been the biggest achievements over the last 5 years on the technology side? And yeah, what have been the biggest achievements and what hasn't gone to plan?
Oh, where do I even start? Maybe I'll start with what hasn't gone to plan. I think when we set out, we had a very different view of how the technology was going to work. We were focused much more on tissue engineering, multi-cell type. We originally started off using this idea of carrier scaffolds, where we would have these sort of structures that would float around in these vessels, and the cells would grow on them, and then they would form these complex tissues on these structures. We did a lot of work on that over the first maybe 18 months and ended up walking away from it entirely because we realized the economics were never going to work for a mass market product. But that shift where we went to...
Is that because it's harder to get the cells to grow on scaffolds?
You can't just add more scaffolds and cells jump across. Once they would grow to completely cover one of the scaffolds, they'd stop growing. And so you had to spend a lot of time trying to work out, can you make them kind of jump to clean scaffolds so that they don't stop growing when they fill up one? We had some progress there, but it was never robust. Then we started to look at, are there cheaper, simpler ways of getting the cells off the scaffold so we can put fresh ones in? But then when you look at the cost of scaling that up, the cost and complexity of scaling that up was really, really high. But where the real problem came is it just wasn't adding enough product benefit. And so when we tried using these more complex systems compared to simpler ones, is there wasn't enough of a sensory benefit. There was no noticeable sensory benefit at all, actually, compared to simpler systems that we grow now, which is just cells floating around in that nutrient media. When we put them next to each other, we couldn't really taste a difference. And so it became pretty clear of, okay, if these things don't taste way better, they're way more risky, way more technically complex, and there's half a dozen different problems we have to solve to commercialize them, or at least move them to a commercial scale before we can even start to contemplate commercialization. Is there a commensurate product benefit? No. Let's simplify. Let's go for a different approach.
Would the scaffolding, in my mind, would that improve? That would change texture, though, right? Because you could then grow like a steak, for example, in theory, if you got that going perfectly. Whereas just growing the cells in a liquid media, you're going to get something more. Or I don't know actually what the texture of that would be like. More sort of mushy, I guess, but having all the flavor of the meat and the fats and everything. Is that right?
Yeah, the way we started. So originally, the intention was always have cells growing on something. And as we realized there was a lot of complexity in scaling that up, we changed the approach to say, okay, well, if we want cells to grow on something, if we want to be able to put them on a scaffold, turn them into a steak, we can grow a lot of them attached to nothing. That's really easy. That's really easy to scale. And then we can move them onto something, a scaffold, where they can differentiate and structure tissue later. In order to do that, we need to be able to figure out how to grow lots of cells. So let's focus on doing that. And let's figure out what products we can commercialize and how far we can push just taking that, effectively, as you said, mush of cells and turning it into finished products, so that we can de-risk what I see as being the bigger challenge, which is if we make these, if it's tasty, will consumers actually adopt it? So let's use this simpler, more scalable process, which we need to figure out anyway in order to get to these more complex products. Let's take products to market from that to figure out what needs to be true for those more complex products to become really desirable down the road.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah. So how do you then get, in the finished product, how do you then get texture from your mush of cells if you're not growing on scaffolds?
It depends on the product. So the parfait, which is the first product we have on market, is pretty straightforward. It's basically take the cells, cook it with some olive oil, eschalots, garlic, thyme, some alcohol, and a bit of butter, and off you go. The foie gras slices that we're launching now, we use a proprietary fat and gelling system as a way of creating those slices that pan fry up really beautifully. And then we've got a pretty interesting way of creating whole cut fibrous products now as well that just uses physical processes. So it doesn't require any biological processes to create those sort of whole cut textures. That said, I can see a scenario in the future where we do want to use biological processes to create even more complex, even more sophisticated textures, adding in additional bioprocess steps after growing lots of cells. But right now we're just using sort of physical transformations, things that mostly you could do in a home kitchen.
Obviously, food products, taste and texture is the most important. We've talked a little bit about that there. Price is the kind of second, and for a lot of customer segments, even more important than taste and texture. Where are you at on, if you don't mind sharing, if you're able to share, costs of production, and where do you see that going over the next 5 to 10 years? Where can you get to?
So we're right now, there's probably two sides to this. One is the where we've gone to market and why, which is we've only gone to market in very high-end restaurants, quite specifically with a luxury good. I looked at our production capabilities, or what I thought our production capabilities would look like in kind of now to 2025 roughly, and we have relatively small production volumes at a relatively high price, which if you flip that around and you say we have authentic scarcity at a relatively high price, those are the preconditions of a good luxury product. We have a highly distinctive product, which is very carefully and quite uniquely crafted. And that's why we've chosen to go to market with Forge as a luxury brand, as opposed to come to market with a mass market food of any kind or go through any mass market channels. When it comes to where we are, we're $100 per kilo at the moment, but we're at this really key inflection point between switching over from factory 1 to factory 2, going from pilot scale to proper commercial scale production. And with factory 2, with some of the new bioprocesses we're bringing in, that's going to get us under that $50 a kilo mark, which is a really key inflection point for us. And
is that Australian or US dollars?
US dollars.
US dollars, yep.
And then there's a pretty clear glide path down from there to, I'd say, sort of supermarket price points, which is much more about just increasing reliability and consistency for processes that we've already proved can deliver those economics. It's much more about how do we operate that? How do we move from doing it once to doing it every single batch repeatably and engineer around all the things that cause that to fail or to vary.
Once you've got that reliability sorted out, so looking at where your production costs could be in 10 years, what are the biggest components of the costs that you'll be able to get it down to?
So the biggest one is the input, so the nutrient media, and then there's a few consumables in the process that we want to essentially eliminate. So things like sterile filters to sterilize the media, the nutrient media. And then the next biggest component is labor, followed by utilities, followed by amortized capex. And so we have ended up, and this is one of the surprises, and kind of going back to your earlier question of sort of what have we done well in technology, we have ended up becoming a fully vertically integrated manufacturer. We design our own production equipment. We have a team of welders in-house that fabricate the vast majority of it. We get tanks made to our designs, and then we integrate it all in-house. And then we have an industrial automation team, which is applying a lot of automation. That means the cost per production line has dropped considerably compared to the third-party vendors in the space. which drops that amortized capex component. Then the next big focus is around automation and consistent operations coming as a result of that automation, which then really drops that labor component. The utilities, we're just doing a lot on better utility design, better utility selection, moving away from things like bottled oxygen to oxygen generators, etc. That drops your utility cost quite considerably. We've got 100 kilowatts of solar on the roof of Factory 2, which right now, on a sunny day, more than covers our entire utility bill. And then the media is something that we have a very predictable cost structure now with our existing supplier that's already contracted to well under $1 a litre. And then the goal over the longer term is to drop that much further. And over the next 10 years, just based on the commodity prices of what goes into that nutrient media, we think we can get around that 30 to 40 cents a litre, give or take. All of those things together get us down to being the cheapest option on the shelf, which was always the goal, which is not just to make this work in a luxury market, but ultimately for cell culture to be the cheapest option, because we have this very tightly integrated production, which goes from a very primitive set of raw ingredients in the media of sugar, salt, amino acids, vitamins, and minerals to a finished product all in one facility in a very, very small number of steps. And so that was one of the things that attracted me to cell culture, is you get these very short supply chains and you have a lot of value-adding transformation in a very, very small number of steps.
Yeah, what you touched on it there. So the nutrient media, you said you think you get it down to 30 or 40 cents a litre. Two questions. One, how many litres do you need for it to produce a kilogram of meat? And two, what are the most expensive bits of that nutrient media? Like, can you mentioned having to put amino acids and vitamins and things in there. Can you simplify it down to sort of waste materials from other agricultural streams or something like that to really bring that cost down?
I'll give a range. It depends on the cell line and the production process. On the low end, it's 10 litres. On the high end, it's about 40. And that depends partly on the maturity of the process. The more mature processes are better yielding, fewer litres per kilo. When it comes to what are the most expensive components, it's a really good question. I was looking at this a few weeks ago and I'm completely forgetting. Some of the amino acids were up there, and there were a few sort of metabolic intermediates, which were reasonably expensive. Some of that you can just reduce by better sourcing. If you're sourcing from different supply chains, or if you're going directly to the supplier and just buying in larger quantities, that often will change the economics very quickly. Some of this you can do by simplification. There's a open debate in the team about whether using waste streams makes sense. You do get some volatility in the composition of waste streams. So you can take something like an agricultural waste and you can hydrolyze it, and you get this mix of amino acids and nutrients, and that can be quite good. But that one batch might be the perfect composition, and the next batch might vary a little bit, and you may get lower yield. And so then the question becomes, how much yield loss are you willing to accept for lower cost? And right now, my thinking generally is towards production consistency. Yield consistency is going to be more important than small cost down over the next 5 years for sure. That may change over that 5 to 10 year period.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, thinking about farming mushrooms, there's a lot of similar sorts of trade-offs. We do use agricultural waste streams for the substrate of mushrooms, and we then get, because those vary, we do get varying nutritional profiles in the mushrooms. I guess potentially mushrooms are maybe more robust, say, than the cell lines, so they can. How does that differ for animal cell lines compared with, say, growing plants and mushrooms? How robust are the cells? Can you even do something with the cells to make them, are there cell lines that might be more robust that you can develop over time?
This is getting into some of the research that we're doing at the moment, where we found if you take what appears to be a homogeneous pool of cells and you put them in different conditions, you'll often have two different conditions that both perform really well. And then when you look at the cells and analyze them, they'll be metabolically really different. And so there's quite a lot. You can sort of train the metabolism of cells in quite a specific way based on how you've grown them in the past. The big difference between cells and mushrooms, or anything in agriculture, is you have a complex multicellular organism, and those cells can then, some proportion of those cells can specialize in certain functions. You don't have that in cell culture. You have a single cell type, which is taking in relatively simple, primitive nutrients to fuel their metabolism. Whereas in a mushroom, you may have one cell type. I'm not sure if this is okay. It's a long time since I've looked at fungal biology, but certainly in something like a plant or an animal, you have cell types that perform a specialized function, which is an intermediate in their metabolism, which you don't have in cell culture. And so if you change the environment of the mushroom, it can often compensate internally to be able to manage that change in its environment and continue to grow really well. And the fact that mushrooms can grow anywhere sort of implies that they can take in a really wide range of nutrients and conditions and adjust for that internally.
So the consumer side is the other area that's like super interesting here. Like how are consumers going to accept cell-based meat products? Are they going to buy them? Are they going to eat them? Talk us through your go-to-market strategy with VOW.
So the way that I've thought about this is the way something is made really matters if you're not offering anything else. So it's a really compelling product at an intellectual level, but because it's not offering you as a consumer, it's not solving a problem for you as a consumer, solving a problem for the planet. It's very easy to get hung up and very engaged about how it's made, is it processed, etc. Whereas if you look at the behavior in a product that really solves a problem, whether you look at something like athletic greens or protein bars or anything like that, is those ingredient lists are similarly processed, but you don't really hear that same criticism and pushback from those consumers because it solves a problem. It's an on-the-go protein-rich snack, which is great, or it solves a particular perceived nutrient deficiency. And so the way that I think about our go-to-market is step one is really simple. It's create luxury food sold on the basis of novelty and exclusivity in the places where people are willing to, and in fact, seek out novelty in very high-end dining. And so that's on the market now in Singapore. We're in a number of venues and we're sort of seeing that play out. We're seeing a really positive response. In fact, I'd say a surprisingly positive response. And when it is on set menus, we're not seeing consumers have any objection to trial at all and generally have a really positive experience, especially with the quail parfait that's been really well received. And so that's right now what we're growing in market and what we're really focused on. Now we've been approved in Singapore and we'll be rolling that out across a few more geographies over the next 6 to 8 months. The second step is then nutrition. So looking at the reasons that people eat meat for nutrition, which broadly comes down to protein, iron, micronutrient density, and in the case of fish, omega-3s. So then our focus is how do we make specific products for people that are seeking out those nutrients that gives you more of that than eating that same animal product or eating an animal product. So if you're eating chicken for protein, for instance, can we just make a product which looks kind of like a chicken fillet but has more protein? And then for that particular highly motivated audience that's willing to pay a premium to have a problem solved, the way that's made, matters a lot less because it solves that particular problem. Similarly with iron deficiency is really common, especially in younger women. And there's a lot of people that we've spoken to who eat beef for the perceived iron content. So if we can make something which has more iron that is in a really high quality bioavailable format that you'd find in meat, but without that same sensory experience of red meat, which is something which keeps coming up as an issue for people that are often eating beef for that iron content, then that is another really highly motivated market, which I suspect will pay a reasonable premium. And so that's step 2 for us. And then as the cost structure supports it, step 3 is then bringing those two worlds together. Really tasty, plus really nutritious, plus really cheap. And so my long-term goal is, I've said this to you before and we've debated this at length, is the whole Cheerios of meat concept, where it's creating these products which are purely branded the way breakfast cereals are, in similar formats. It might be mince, it might be sort of like a simple fillet which you could stir fry or put into a curry, or it might be a full cut steak or larger fillet, but offering a really distinct nutritional profile and ideally sensory profile as well. So you're going into the supermarket and you're buying a branded mince product which has the nutrition of salmon but with more protein, but the sensory experience of a venison mince. And it's made up of 3 or 4 different cell types from different species as a way of building up that really unique sensory and nutritional profile. And if that's at the same price point or a lower price point than beef you'd otherwise eat, that purchasing decision becomes, do I want the cheaper, more nutritious, tastier option, or do I want the thing that I've always eaten? And that feels like a behavior change which is much easier to navigate because it's solving a problem for you. It's helping you achieve your goals as opposed to being a decision for sustainability or ethics. The interesting thing about the Cheerios analogy is if you look back to the origin of a lot of these breakfast cereals, they had this really brief window of technical advantage. General Mills, or whatever the precursor General Mills was, had an understanding about high moisture extrusion and how to apply it to these mixed grains, which was quite unique for a very, very small number of years. And in that time, they built a brand which has now endured for almost a century. It was, I think, launched in the early 40s, and it's 2024. I can walk into a supermarket in Australia, in the US, across Europe, and I can find Cheerios, which is more or less the same as it was, or very close to the same as it was in the 1940s, 80 years after that technical advantage was washed out. And I think that's a really interesting case study of how you can use a transient technological advantage to build an enduring brand advantage. And that's something that I really hope we can navigate.
Yeah, I wonder in that case, I've not read enough about the sort of advent of the cereal industry, but I suspect it's convenience that is what drove customers to those products. Like previously it might have been cooking oatmeal or porridge, and then instead you get your oats extruded, and then now you don't have to cook them. You just put milk straight on them, and it's convenience.
That's one part of it. The other part was around the novelty of the sensory experience. So to have something which has that sort of that crunch, especially when it's soaked in milk, is quite a unique way of consuming a cereal, grain-based product. And so it seems like sort of hard to tell. There's not a huge amount of first-hand accounts written about the first people eating Cheerios in the 1940s, but it seems like those two things were buzzing around as like the two drivers. Yes, it's more convenient. There's no oatmeal to cook. It also is quite distinctive and unique, which together seem to drive some kind of adoption.
Yeah, so in your case, potentially, you can create something that's an amazing, unique sensory experience. You can create something could you do something that's more convenient than animal meat in what you're doing, or it's going to be more the sensory experience?
I think a lot about shelf life as being a big opportunity there. Meat, even with some of these modern modified atmosphere packing and skin packing, you get a couple of weeks, which is not bad at all. It's a lot more convenient than it was 20 years ago. For us, we have, we're harvesting from an aseptic process. And so depending on how we handle that downstream, I see no reason we couldn't have an extremely long shelf life if we maintain that very high level of cleanliness. And so that then becomes one of the possible convenience ways of delivering quite a unique convenience in the product.
And there's this whole real food trend, like even the example you gave there of athletic greens, whilst their product is actually fairly processed to be able to extract all of the powders that they put in athletic greens, certainly their positioning and the consumer perception is that this is an incredibly healthy product because it's got all of these natural things in it, algae and mushrooms and all sorts of natural things that are foods that are really good for you. So cell-based meat, it feels like it's a space that the meat industry's got a lot of money. The meat industry's gone and attacked the plant-based space for using methylcellulose. They ran Super Bowl ads doing a spelling bee on methylcellulose and calling out plant-based food products for being too processed. And that seems to have been quite effective. It feels like the cell-based space is a space that could be sort of open to attack in similar ways from the meat industry. How do you think about how that's going to play out? And I'd love your thoughts.
Plant-based space antagonized the meat industry quite a lot, while also really riding on the brand reputation that had been built up by that industry. And that combination of really denigrating farming and also using the brand of especially beef to try to sell their products was a particularly offensive combination. As a company, what I've really tried to do with VOW is distance ourselves from the world of alternative proteins. And it's like, how do we position ourselves as something which is quite distinctive? And also, how do we avoid making this an us versus them? And so the way we think about that is we don't make what farmers make. And what we do make is sold on the basis of what it is as opposed to what it isn't. So it's not, this is not beef and therefore you should eat it. It's, this is new and different and therefore you should eat it. And so that has so far diffused a lot of the tension with the meat industry. When it comes to what we do, we've taken an approach so far of just being very transparent, and we'll continue to do so. We're publishing a lot of safety data over the coming couple of years, a lot of process data, life cycle assessments, process performance, etc. And so putting a lot of that information out there, while I suspect a very small number of consumers will seek that out, my hope is that that being out there and not taking an antagonistic position against the existing meat industry will hopefully diffuse a lot of that tension. And ultimately, it should be up to consumers to decide. It's very strange to see, especially what's been happening in Florida and Alabama, as right-wing free market states that are banning a product as opposed to letting a market decide. It's a very sort of strange trend, very, very strange trend to see. And I hope by us being transparent and by us not antagonizing the incumbent industry, we're going to have the chance to let consumers make that decision as opposed to governments.
Yeah, I suppose the meat industry is going to, whether you, in your sort of wording and messaging, antagonize them, they're going to feel the antagonization if you're successful and you're starting to take market share from them. So you may still have that challenge that way.
I think if we're taking market share from the meat industry, we're going to it's going to be a few years down the track at least. So I've got some time to figure it out.
Okay, so go-to-market strategy is position premium. You launched into Fura in Singapore, really high-end restaurant, and the plan is to expand out to more from that.
Yeah, so we're in, I think it's 3 venues at the moment: Fura, Tippling Club, and Restaurant Fizz, with a few more launching over the coming weeks. We're going to be announcing there's going to be 2 or 3 more geographies in 2024, which we'll be announcing later this year. But similar rollout, high-end restaurants, followed by high-end hotels and really high-end catering. The reason for that was it's an environment where you naturally are seeking novelty. You're going to these restaurants to have new experiences curated by that chef. And so you already have that suspension of disbelief and that comfort with newness. The second reason is it gives consumers a really good experience of the product. And I know you and I have spoken about this at length of if someone buys some fable in the supermarket and cooks it poorly, it's your fault, regardless of how poor the cooking was. And so food service is a really powerful way, especially that very high-end food service, is a really powerful way of quality controlling for that first experience.
So the customers that you're getting into those restaurants, they're seeking out the novelty. That's the big driver for them.
In general, yeah. And exclusivity. So speaking to both chefs and consumers in Singapore, there is a sense that all restaurants have access to the same ingredients. And so we give restaurants new and unique ingredients for them to add to their menu. And that gives the regulars something new to learn about and talk about, and something new for the waitstaff to point to. And for customers that are coming there for the first time, is it gives some element of exclusivity and distinctiveness. It's like when you go to a restaurant and they talk about, oh, we work with this vineyard and we have exclusive access to these wines, or we went to Japan and sourced these scallops directly from the fishermen. It's all about demonstrating that there's some unique access that the restaurant has to experiences you can't get anywhere else. And this is cultured meat, and especially novel versions of cultured meat we produce, is a very unique and extreme version of that exclusivity.
Challenge with that market though is it will be small. You're defining you need the exclusivity to make it work and the novelty for the customer. So what's the next segment you go to after that one?
So the plan has always been to build out multiple brands with different value propositions. And so the plan is basically grow Forge as a luxury brand to where we think it makes sense, and we'll be feeling that out over the next 12 months of how big we want to get that without diluting the core value proposition. And it'll be a high margin business, which will give us some free cash flow to invest in the R&D of what will ultimately become mass market. It also gives us a testing ground for innovative, unusual concepts that we want to get some feedback on. And that's a really strong and the cultural halo around being in those high-end restaurants. The big focus internally in both our R&D and product development at the moment is on those nutritious products. I see that as being the first volume driver and the first habitual product. You might go to one of these high-end restaurants once or twice a year, and you might have 1 or 2 dishes in those trips. And that's for a regular consumer, the maximum I expect Forge is going to be consumed. The goal or the question is then, how do you shift from that very rare occasional consumption to some kind of habitual consumption? And I believe the best way to do that is create performance food type offerings, which a small number of consumers can be eating much more frequently, as a way of really normalizing the technology in groups that are early adopters of new types of food that offer a particular value proposition. And using the example of athletic greens, is that was a food that was very much, that was a supplement that was very much in that professional athletes, longevity, health tech type community for a number of years before it started to break into more mainstream health and fitness. And I think creatines as a supplement has gone through similar things over the last probably decade or so. And I suspect we'll see a continuation of this where it's like things come into that sort of health and fitness market and then will filter down to a more mainstream market to some degree. Protein snacking is another one in general. It's like protein snacking went from being quite a niche to something which is quite mainstream.
Yeah. Well, what's going through my head there is a lot of successful brands in that space have been supplements, because there's almost this difference in a consumer's mind. It's like, I'll take a supplement for health and I'll eat food for taste. I was trying to think of examples where the two kind of cross over, but I guess protein snacking is an example of that, where you've got...
There was a supermarket, a health food store this week, and looking at the sheer number of like protein cookies and cakes and muffins that they're now that are sitting in that crossover category, where it's almost like enhanced snacking or like performance snacking seems to be to be getting some momentum behind it. There's also, when it comes to more, I'd say like center of plate protein with a taste compromise, a lot of the, I guess, the offal and the carnivore type movements are examples where it seems like consumers are quite willing to compromise on the sensory experience. I don't think anyone enjoys eating liver, but the prevalence of liver in the world of health influencers at the moment implies there is a willingness to compromise on the sensory experience of a center of plate protein for a perceived nutritional benefit, at least in some small subset of consumers. How big that could get for us, don't know, but I think that's a really interesting space for us to be testing and learning. It also fulfills what I see as being the other really important need that we need, or the four really important things. It's like taste, nutrition, cost, and texture as the four main things that we need to deliver on. And if we can deliver on all four, then we're going to be in a really good place. And Forged is a really good place for us to learn how to make really tasty food. Then with these nutritious products, that's a chance for us to learn how to make really nutritious food with a really small number of ingredients. And then it's a matter of making those really tasty, really nutritious foods have a really great texture, and then do that at a really low price point. And I believe there would be a very large market for that, assuming we can jump over that next set of R&D hurdles. This is sort of how I've been thinking about the market, or I think how we've both been thinking about the market in quite a different way to the first wave companies. If you look at Impossible and Beyond in particular, it was like go in with the most consumed product. It's like go in with beef mince and try to make something which works for everyone. I think our approach has always been to say, find these highly motivated customer segments, which individually aren't going to be that big, but let's go and nail 3 or 4 of these little ones using the same supply chain, the same manufacturing. So there's some economies of scale which are shared across that product portfolio, and then grow each of those. And so rather than sort of, if you imagine the bell curve of meat eaters like that, rather than going for the products in the middle for everyone all at once and delivering something which is kind of good for a lot of people but not great for anyone, is let's try to go for the fringes and try to grow into the middle over time and almost like do the Swiss cheese approach to the market. Not try to attack it head on, but try to take little chunks out and grow each of those little chunks over time.
Super interested to chat to you about your Mammoth Meatball and the PR that you got out of that. I thought that was incredible. I think it's one of the best pieces of PR I've seen from any startup, and the fact it came from a cell-based meat company, not necessarily a company that should be strong in marketing or PR, but has obviously got some interesting stories to share. Firstly, well done. Do you mind just taking us through just briefly how it came about, and then sort of what your goals were out of it, how that played out?
So a lot of the credit of this goes to my co-founder, Tim. Very early on in the VOW journey, he had a correct insight, which was we're trying to create a cultural shift. And in that cultural shift, we have to create a really global conversation about what we want to choose our food in the future to be. And I think it was in the first year of VOW, it was very, very early on. He got in touch with this guy at Wunderman Thompson in the Netherlands, who is their global creative director, and he was looking for something for them to work on for one of their Cannes Lion, their sort of internal projects for Cannes Lion. And we were originally working on a dodo nugget, and so we started on that project. It turned out that the academic group that had the dodo genome wouldn't let us have it, and so we had to find a publicly available genome, which was the mammoth one, slotted a gene into a cell line we had, grew a bunch and turned it into a big meatball, covered it in resin, and then shipped it to the Netherlands. And so that was basically what we did. And then the guys at Wunderman Thompson put a bit of budget in. We spent $0 on marketing for this, which was the crazy part, given how viral it went. So the guys at Wonderman Thompson spent quite a bit on films and everything that they wanted for their and websites for their Cannes Lion entry. And we did like an article with The Guardian, and for about 8 hours, nothing happened. And we're like, oh, okay, I guess no one really paid attention. And then went to bed and woke up the next day and looked at my phone, and I had like 140 messages. And I was like, oh no, what's happened? And it just went completely uncontrollably viral for about 2 weeks. And it was just absolutely everywhere. What we were trying to do there was to give people a really simple way of starting to build this pathway in their mind of the meat that we can choose to eat in the future can be different from what we have today. And also to make what we were going to launch with, which was our cultured Japanese quail, seem much more normal by comparison. It's like once you sort of have mammoth as like weird, is the weird cultured meat in your mind, as quail feels quite normal by comparison and quite familiar, and start a lot of conversations along the way. And I think it did that. I still go places and people are like, oh, did you hear about that Mammoth Meatball? Like, yeah, we did that. That was us. Oh my God, that's crazy. I can't believe you guys are the Mammoth Meatball guys. But it is actually a really useful way to start a conversation with a chef, because it gives them this framing of like, you're not the same as other companies that have approached us. You're doing something really quite different.
Yeah, measurable outcomes out of it. So you mentioned there, it's like helping you frame up conversations with chefs. Probably I'd imagine a lot of chefs around the world saw the press, so that would work. Yeah, any other benefits have come out of it?
It sort of separated us out from the pack in a very deliberate way. And I mentioned earlier, is like there's a lot of these companies which are very much following the same narrative around substitution and direct replacement. And this sort of pulled us away. And it's like there's all those guys, and then there's these weird Mammoth Meatball guys in Australia. And it's helped just give us a bit of breathing space to define and own our own story and not kind of get grouped in with an industry which has a very different approach and a very different philosophy.
I like your go-to-market strategy and your approach for how you're taking the products to market. Say all of that fails. Say the meat industry attacks you. You're only able to get sort of some really small niche segments in the food space. You've built some incredible technology. Are there other uses for that technology? Are there pivots that you could take if you were forced to, because the food side didn't work out?
The short answer is yes. We never intended to be a manufacturer. We intended to contract manufacture. It became pretty clear in the first half of 2022 that there was no one with the capability, the cost structure, or the ambition that had cell culture capability to keep up with our goals. So we had to in-house manufacturing only about 2.5 years ago now. We've become quite good at it. We've got a very, as far as I know, by quite a good margin, the largest operating cell culture line for food production anywhere in the world by quite a margin. We've designed and engineered all of that ourselves now, and the cost advantage, both in terms of CapEx and ultimately cell culture costs, seems to be somewhere around 10 to 100x better than anyone else has achieved. And so one of the questions that we've been mulling over internally is, what other applications could there be for very low cost cell culture? And we've had approaches from pharmaceutical companies which are interested in cell lines for a range of different reasons. We've had approaches from cell therapy companies which are really interested in the manufacturing cost down and the glide path we've been able to achieve on that. We've been looking into cosmetics and personal care. There's a number of different animal products or sort of animal adjacent products, petrochemical products even, that we could potentially replace in a really, or even have new ingredients entirely, which is looking very interesting and very promising, as well as food ingredients and complex flavors. So there's quite a few different other applications outside of the core business. The way that I'm thinking about this at the moment, the more we make of anything, the cheaper everything we make becomes. And so my goal over the next few years is to ramp our manufacturing capacity through whatever means possible as a way of bringing down the cost of our core products as rapidly as possible, to understand who is purchasing at what scale and why. And that will tell us where we should be, what we should be making for who, and where we should be distributing that, whether it's inside food, outside, but ideally both, because they really do support each other in a really positive way.
What are the things you've done that the technology that you've developed that's different to all the other cell-based meat companies? Like you've got a very different go-to-market strategy. You're not trying to do beef or chicken or seafood like most of the others. You've outlined that strategy, which I think is awesome. On the technology side, where do you think you guys lead compared with everyone else in the space?
So there's 3 companies which have been approved to sell. There's Upside, who's raised 605 million US, I think. Eat Just, which has raised, I think, 8 or 900 million, but well over half a billion. And then there's VOW, and with our little 56 million in Australia. And at least as of when we launched, we were the only company that was regularly selling. Just is currently selling their 3% chicken cell product in Hubers in Singapore as well. There's a lot of different things which has helped us get as far as we have with a relatively small amount of capital and a relatively short amount of time. The biggest advantage is it ended up coming from manufacturing, of being willing to take on a lot more than I think most companies are. We have equipment design, process software, fabrication, commissioning, operation, maintenance are all in-house. Like we do absolutely everything ourselves. And so when we have made a poor design decision, we can just refabricate a pipe that day and reinstall it and then continue to operate, which has really accelerated our learning rate. And that core philosophy of how do we accelerate our rate of learning across biology, product development, and scale up has really driven a lot of our advantage. It feels like a lot of people are looking for, here's the one technical thing that we have that is unique and that gives us this capability that no one else has. But in a space as complex as cell culture for food, it's not like there's a single magic thing with cell lines or with your media or with your bioreactors which gives you a huge advantage. It's the integration of dozens of different reasonably high certainty things. Like cell lines have existed, which are complex cell lines in pharma, have existed for more than half a century. Serum-free medias have existed for 30 years. Like bioreactors at large scales have been first. Animal cell culture have been in operation since the 80s. Like there's nothing new about each of these things. It's about how do you integrate a bunch of things which have worked independently in other applications at different cost structures. And that requires this rate of learning and this relentless ability to fail and learn from it and get better as a result of it. And so not about a technology. It's more about a culture, a way of working, and kind of a company-wide risk tolerance to fail and get up, dust yourself off, and try again.
Yeah, George, I love what you're doing. We obviously took different paths in 2019, and yeah, I too am happy with the path that we took. But I love what you've built, what you're creating. Love seeing you succeed in all of this, and yeah, love seeing things like the Mammoth Meatball PR you launched in Singapore. I think your go-to-market strategy is awesome. So yeah, it's a real pleasure catching up with you and being on the journey with you, George. So yeah, thanks for coming and chatting.
Likewise, and thank you for all the help, all the ideas, and the sounding board over the last 5 years, and for the next 5 years.